of our task force here. And just like to welcome everyone here. And I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl. She's going to have a few housekeeping items and just kind of explain how things are going to go through today and everything else. So I'm just going to turn it over to Cheryl. You go ahead, Cheryl.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad that you could join us this evening. This is our fourth session of our expert speaker series, and we and we're delighted to have our outstanding speakers with us this evening, Dr. Dryden and Rushton Southwell. I just want to go through a few. I should explain that my name is Cheryl McDaniel, and I'm an originating member of the task force, and co-chair along with Professor David Dryden. And our task force was started in 2020, and for anybody that's interested in any further information about our task force, I would invite you to go to Rotary 7820 website, their homepage. And before David introduces our first guest speaker and talks about our topic this evening, which is in Indigenous peoples and communities of African descent, I just want to go through a few housekeeping items. So if you haven't done so already, if you could just click mute and put your screen on view. You will see periodically rotating that there is a screen, and it does house our agenda, bios on our guest speakers, and instructions about the chat box. So we really encourage everyone to ask as many questions as possible. They will go directly into the chat box. Everything is recorded and it's going to be captured. So if your question isn't answered here tonight, not to worry, because we are going to answer it and upload it to our Rotary website. And I'd also like to thank Jason, who is our moderator for this evening, along with our co-host, who is Holly Thompson. So David, I'm going to pass the baton over to you to introduce our first guest speaker.
David, you're muted there. So just if you could unmute, please. No, we're not hearing anything, David.
I have the enormous privilege of introducing the James R. Johnson Chair in Black Canadian Studies, Dr. Dryden. I have huge respect for Dr. Dryden. She has introduced a further sparkle in the life of the James R. Johnson Chair. And I believe that will be further lit this evening in her outline of some of the future possibilities in terms of highlighting a story as yet untold. And that is about the relationship between allies and Africans of Canadian descent. And this is really important because the relationship between Indigenous peoples and those of African descent is as yet untold. And Dr. Dryden will highlight the possibility of throwing further light on the allyship between those two sets of communities. And so I'm going to pass the torch to Dr. Dryden. Dr. Dryden, I'm in your debt.
Thank you so much, Professor Devine. Honestly, it's just great to be here. And I was glad you asked me. And of course, I said yes. And do people say no to you? I can't imagine that they do. So thank you so much again for inviting me. And I just think it's great that I get to be in conversation with you all and in this conversation with Mr. Reston. Good evening. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes. My apologies, we just got a new kitten. So if you hear crying in the background, she's in her crate, but she's fine. So just so you know, in case you hear that. So yes, I'm the James R. Johnston Chair, trying to fulfill the huge steps taken by Professor Devine. So the Johnston Chair of Black Canadian Studies in the Faculty of Medicine. And so I'm going to start in the way that I do when I do most of my conversations, because I think it lends some information around the relationship between Indigenous people, Mi'kmaq folks here in Mi'kma'ki, and people of African descent, African Nova Scotian. So I'm going to start that way. And then I just have some ideas. I am a scholar, I am a researcher. I am working in the Faculty of Medicine at the site of Medicine and Health. And so I'm going to provide just some insights, I hope, into what it means, how we can understand systemic racism and the similarities with Indigenous folks and people of African descent. That's kind of my plan. Let me know when I get to 10 minutes, because professors, we can go on. So just let me know when, I've used up all my time, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So I always begin with the land acknowledgement. We currently work, live, and study in Chibuktuk, Halifax, the traditional unceded territory of the Maliseet, whose ancestors, along with the Mi'kmaq and Passamaquoddy nations, signed peace and friendship treaties with the British Crown in the 1700s. Yet we must not forget that these treaties were signed roughly 140 years before the end of slavery in this region now called Canada. Halifax was imposed upon Chibuktuk in 1749, and it was enslaved African people who were used to dig out the roads and build the city, including much of the citadel. On the southern shore of the Bedford Basin, Mi'kmaq folks, Mi'kmaq communities shared land with Black people, and this is what allowed Africville to be founded in the mid-1800s. And as we know, only later to be demolished by the city government in the 1960s, claiming public health concerns. It was bulldozed to the ground in the middle of the night. So in this acknowledgement and honoring Indigenous and Black people who were here, are here, and continue to be here, I also am honoring and recognizing the connection between genocide and what we call, in some scholarship circles, the afterlife of slavery, the continuing impact that slavery has on our lives in 2021. And that, we stand committed to reconciliation and remain engaged in anti-colonialism, which of course includes disrupting anti-Black racism. So as you know, I'm sure, the Johnston Chair was named after Mr. Robinson Johnston, who's an African Nova Scotian man and the first African Nova Scotian person to earn a degree at Dal in 1896, and the first African Nova Scotian person to earn a degree in a university in Canada, and the first Black lawyer to practice in Nova Scotia. And he died tragically in 1915, just days before his 39th birthday. So in 1991, 30 years ago, the Dalhousie University established a senior academic research chair in Black studies in Halifax to honor the legacy of Mr. Johnston, but also to honor the unique historical presence of African Nova Scotian and Black Scotian people. Because as we know, the oldest communities of Black people are here in Nova Scotia. The oldest communities of Black people in Canada are here in Nova Scotia. And it's been 25 years since the first appointment, which was Dr. Thornhill. It then moved to Professor Devine, Dr. Cooper, and now myself. So what's unique about the Johnston Chair is that it has a 6-year term. Sometimes they're 2 years or 5 years. The Johnson Chair is a 6-year term. And as I just stated, it goes from faculty to faculty to faculty. And one of the reasons it does that is really to identify the breadth of Black studies, the fact that there is a place for it in law, there is a place for it in health professions or social work, there is a place for it in the arts and sciences, where we usually think about Black studies. We think about it in the humanities and liberal arts. And this is the first time that the Johnston Chair has been in the Faculty of Medicine. And I'm the first queer person to hold the chair. So these are important milestones. So I want to go back now to thinking about colonialism and anti-Black racism. So what we know about colonialism is that not only was it simultaneously attempting to move Indigenous people off out of their territories, right? So, and by any means. So, you know, the gifting of blankets that had, that were infused with disease. So we know the impacts of smallpox and how devastating that was for Indigenous communities here in North America. But the other part about colonialism in Canada that many people either don't know or are uncomfortable speaking about is slavery, that there was slavery here. And that Black people in North America or Black people in Canada, not only were they present in this region before slavery, but our numbers increased during slavery and then increased again during immigration, right? And so I think we're largely familiar with Black people coming through immigration. And then we believe that that's the only way that Black people got here. And then we believe that since Black people came through immigration, that there are no relationships with slavery. And that's just not the case. The transatlantic slave trade, you know, really is connected throughout the Americas, throughout the Caribbean region, and throughout southern parts of Africa. So regardless of when you arrive in North America or in Canada, once here, you still need to grapple with the afterlife of slavery. So when we talk about colonialism, we tend to only think about what those experiences are for Indigenous people, like the residential school system, being absconded out of families and placed with white families, working to remove the Indian from Indigenous people. But the part that we need to pay more attention to is how that colonialism was also supported and shored up through slavery and the impacts after slavery. So this is where I think, you know, it's important we think about the relationship between Black and Indigenous people and work to overcome that kind of divide and conquer piece around, well, colonialism was only for Indigenous people and Black people are only newcomers. We really need to grapple with the realities of slavery in our lives, regardless of the regions, you know, where we may be from if we're recent arrivals. And that's why it's important to make sure we're not claiming that Black people are settlers, because we are not. We, the ways in which slavery completely restructured capitalist systems, completely restructured governance, restructured legal systems. We cannot then say, oh, Black people are settlers. We just do not have access to the same kind of capital that white supremacy has afforded white people. Then the other piece I wanted to mention is when we think about Indigenous people, and the word Indigenous is pretty recent actually, and it's wider use. Before we were using Native, Aboriginal, and Indigenous was at that time saved to talk about the fact that we all have some form of indigeneity, that you know, people born and lived in Africa are indigenous to Ghana, to Nigeria, to Benin, right? That there were indigenous communities throughout the Caribbean, and we believe that those indigenous communities were completely eradicated, but that's not true because they are there were slave economies, Indigenous people still exist through Black Caribbean people. And so one of the reasons why it's important to understand that colonialism did not failed at eradicating Indigenous people in North America, but slavery did not take away the indigeneity of Black people. And so it may seem like semantics or a turn of the phrase, but I think it really helps us better understand our historical placement in the globe and what that means right now in North America.
So Dr. Dryden, you're coming up
Yes.
on your time there.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
So this is where I come to this work in health. So I'm doing a jump from history to present, but this is where I come to this work in health. When I'm working with, I'm teaching right now year 2 med students, and there's always this argument somehow, like a zero-sum game argument, that if I'm doing work on Black health, that means that we're not getting information on Indigenous health or the impacts of colonialism on health. And I always refute that because, as I just said, colonialism, including the practice of slavery, continues to impact our health today in this present moment. And so when I'm speaking about the history of anti-Black racism on Black health in 2021, I'm also speaking about colonialism. So for a quick example, the first medical school in Canada opened in 1824, yet slavery did not end in Canada until 1834. So you can't create a medical system and have medical education and training in that system at a time when Black people weren't considered humans, at a time when Black people were considered chattel, and not think that would have an impact on health and wellness and care, and then understanding that it continues to have an impact on health and wellness and care today, where Black people are assumed to have thicker skin, not feel pain in the same way, have differential lung capacities. All of these things come out of colonial medicine that continue to impact our health today. So when I'm talking about, so when we see Idle No More and Black Lives Matter, what we're seeing are groups that have been working separately, but are increasingly working together to address continuing colonial impacts of racism today, and also creating space for Afro-Indigenous people, Black people who are Indigenous, for, say, with Mi'kmaq, Cree, Haudenosaunee, right, to Turtle Island, and also Black people in Nova Scotia who identify as Indigenous Black people. So I have a lot more, but I'm going to stop there. I'm looking forward to conversations. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to our conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Doctor. That was you could tell we're just very, very lightly scratching the surface here. There's so much more that we can talk about and kind of spend the whole hour just discussing this. So I just would like to open it up to any questions. So in the chat, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type it out and we can ask it. And if there's anything in that anyone would like to add. Russ, I see you had your hand up there. Do you have something you want to add to that? By all means, go ahead.
No, I was just trying to do the applause, and I think I hit the wrong.
I saw the wave there, so I just wanted to make sure that you didn't have something else that you want to add. So I think that this is a very interesting topic. It's so many different facets to it, for sure. David, do you have something that you want to add there?
Yes, if I may, Jason, could I ask Dr. Dryden, and thank you so much for that excellent introduction. Could you talk about some of the possible future publications that may be in the offing in respect of the connection between those of us of African descent in Canada and the Indigenous peoples of Canada? Oh, you're on mute, Dr. Dryden.
Muted.
Yeah.
It's only been 20 months.
That's the word of the next 2 years is you are on mute. Go ahead, Doctor.
Muted. Oh my goodness. At least it taught us the difference between moot and mute. And so for those that would confuse those, now we know the difference. So many of the texts that I know are scholarly and research texts, but those aren't the only ones. There's some really fantastic blogs and a couple of community conferences that are coming up, and I'm happy to share those links in the text. But one book that comes to mind is about Black Studies and Native Studies, written by a colleague of mine, Dr. Tiffany Lethabo King, called Black Shoals. And she talks about, in essence, the connection of land to water. And so, Blackness came into the world through slavery, and through that water from, the slave castles in Ghana, and then the way in which it, dropped us off in many different places. But it was that transition from that particular piece of land to North America where we became Black. That's the word I'm going to use today. That's not the word they used then. And so she speaks about what it means to talk about land acknowledgements and territory at the same time of grappling with, well, what does, how about us that kind of came into being through water, which is why in all of my land acknowledgements, I always make sure I acknowledge historical Black communities, because in order to address colonialism, we need to make sure we're addressing both of our realities. And then there's in Toronto, there's a group called, I think, Red Sun Rising. I need to check that. Organized by Afro-Indigenous people, so Black and Indigenous people, Black and Haudenosaunee, Black and Cree, Black and Mohawk, who were doing work around Black Lives Matter last summer and continue to be doing some of that work. And so they were really making sure that they were having this integrated conversation around indigeneity and Blackness, around political interventions. And so things like that are really interesting. And I do believe, but I have to confirm this, that there's also a documentary coming out talking about Afro-Indigenous identities, but specifically talking about Black and Indigenous relations. So let me find those links and I will jot them in the chat. And I will do that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dryden. Very helpful indeed. Thank you, Jason. Over to you.
Thank you. And that's as you're talking about the connection to water, that's something that people kind of miss at some point when they're really thinking about it, how that kind of flows through, no pun intended. But we have another question here in the chat. What reception do you find with your students at the School of Medicine on this topic? Like, how does that kind of work for you?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. I think in some ways they're just like many other students, right? So you have students who are skeptical. They're just like, what do you know? and those are actually my favorite students. Don't tell them, because they get into this grapple with you, but it means they're grappling with the information. And which is really what you want. You want students to be in the information and kind of have it, restructure what they think they know. And so much of teaching is about unlearning so they can learn new things. But for medical students, this is the first time they've ever really had to grapple with racism in medicine. And so while the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has insisted that, rightfully, that there be information about Indigenous people's experience in healthcare, this year and last year were the only years, first 2 years, that there's been concerted focus on Black people in healthcare and health outcomes. And so for many students, they're just drinking it in, and they're like, oh, we need more. And other students, so some students are drinking it in, telling me more. Some students are like, how do I not do that? How do I make sure I'm not racist to my Black patients and Black colleagues and Black community members? And others are like, well, does that really happen? So that's the skeptical part. And that's where there's an overabundance of examples of the ways in which Black people can be and have been harmed out of health systems. And then to throw in a little wrench, I remind them that the Black people that they meet won't just be the same person. The experiences Black men and boys have is different than Black women and girls, different than Black LGBTQ folks, and different than Afro-Indigenous Black folks. So I try to throw it all in there, just so they know that they need to think critically, as they generally do anyway, when they have a Black person or Indigenous person in front of them as a patient.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Great answer. I really like that. It made me actually think of a documentary I recently watched on Netflix, and it talking about food and everything else. And it was called Hide in the Hog, and how it all kind of flowed through and how it really dealt with it. And people just didn't get that the food that they were eating actually came, it can be tracked directly and very quickly back to Africa. It was very, very interesting. It was a great documentary. So we're going to move on from this part of our Q&A to our next presentation. So I'm going to ask Trinda to do the introduction for our next presentation. Trinda, over to you.
Thank you, Jason. I'm pleased to introduce Rustam Southwell to you. He is an entrepreneurial leader with many years of experience developing and executing innovative business development and community-based initiatives. He has a proven track record of designing and implementing effective integrated programs that generate awareness about the role and importance of arts in enhancing social and economic well-being for communities across North America. Starting in 1996, Rustam led the BBI, which is an acronym for the Black Business Initiative Society and related entities, from a fledgling organization to an integral part of the economic landscape of Nova Scotia. For those of you who are joining us from elsewhere, he has worked tirelessly to be a positive influence on Nova Scotia business culture by promoting and supporting the development of Black-owned businesses. Drum roll, please. Rustam, go for it.
Thank you, Trinda. And good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I want to in particular thank Cheryl and David for getting me on this list. As Trinda pointed out, it's an interesting time for us. Not only is the economy is rocked with COVID, we had the murder of George Floyd just over a year ago, and that has made significant impact on those of us in the economic side of business development. So having said that, as from Trinda's introduction, you would note that we celebrate 25 years this week. We launched in 1996 in October, official launch was, and we have a reception coming up. And there are reasons that are connected to why an organization like this had to be designed in 1996 to address those areas. In my own experience, one of the longest standing friends is David Devine, and I recall he was doing Black Men Survive in the 90s in Nova Scotia when I was on Gardigan Street doing business development in a small office trying to get Black entrepreneurs to realize the importance of the economy. And so we celebrate that this week. And more importantly, it was only last week we had gotten junior achievers to be motivated to have Viola Desmond in the Hall of Fame, the Business Hall of Fame, among some distinguished business owners in Nova Scotia. So when in our future history we reflect on her exemplary life, we will quickly realize that the events of November the 8th, 1946, which is just a few days ago, 75 years, are recorded as a powerful moment in history of social justice, or injustice in this case, in Canada. We will argue that the events were not Mrs. Desmond's most significant contribution to Nova Scotia. For our side, we believe that her role as a Black female entrepreneur and leader was more impressive and groundbreaking, and ought to be celebrated as such. A success based on unwavering tenacity, hard work, and overwhelming spirit, she managed to face hurdles head on, and her whole can-do attitude has survived and made her a distinguished person. As an entrepreneur and a trailblazer and an activist in the community, her story of business success continues to inspire, and the evidence is seen with the late Bev Maskell and others who have managed significant businesses. Viola Desmond is known as a social justice icon and elevated to a revered shining star who is celebrated among significant Black leaders over a period of time. Du Bois, Garvey, Malcolm X, Dr. King, and Rosa Parks. She's revered and on the banknote of the Canadian $10 bill. And in fact, that was the International Banknote Society had named the best notes in 2018. The reason why we celebrate her, because at the time when she got dragged out of the theater and placed in prison for sitting in the wrong spot at the wrong time, she was not just a fledgling business owner, she was a franchisee of her hairdressing empire. And I say empire because that is a history that could have been. And so many times in Black communities and Indigenous communities, we always speak of opportunities lost, not at our hands. I know Dr. Dryden was just speaking about colonialism and the way one gets held back. Who could have told of the untold glory of a company in 1946? And I can say that Sobeys and others would have had competitors had that not happened to her. And so often we've seen that in Black and in the Indigenous communities. The strategy that we actually have set out on, it's no secret that our communities were commoditized, our communities were marginalized, both Indigenous and Black communities, from being full participants in the economy. And because of that, we are starting the race, no pun intended, from behind. We're actually moving along in different ways. The need for relationships along those lines has become important. And Dr. Dryden has spoken about the historical significance, the impact of slavery and marginalization in Indigenous communities, and how that manifests itself on the economy. Well, there's a wealth and richness of Black entrepreneurs and Indigenous entrepreneurs who are hardworking, strategic, and have been for years making significant breakthrough into various sectors of the economy. Our organization over the years have begun to seek relationships that can grow companies in the Black community in partnership with various others in the Indigenous community. And I'm not sure if everyone understands the impact that African Nova Scotian, African Canadian companies are making, or even the richness of the Indigenous community. If you think even here in Nova Scotia, the work that's been done with Member 2 in Cape Breton is a phenomenal statement for how organizations can lift communities up by using the means available to them. Burn Christmas and Dan Christmas and others have worked hard in building those economies and have had relationships with organizations like the BBI as well in doing that work. Ullenweg and other business strategies have combined to make those impacts as well as the Millbrook First Nations. As you drive into Truro, you can see that impact. The fact that organizations like this in the communities in response to the centuries of marginalization and trying to be totally included in developing those communities in intergenerational wealth and other strategies, which is yet to be fully discovered. Let's take a deeper look at some of those strategies. You may have seen the news lately, not too long ago, with Clearwater, for example, where First Nations communities are actually now looking at strategic investments to grow wealth and grow the communities. Our community, the African Canadian community, could very well learn from that fact as well. BBI has been part of the Black Entrepreneurship Program with the federal government over the past year, doing a significant investment in the community to move entrepreneurs, business owners, and business sectors as well. For years, the First Nations and Aboriginal communities saw this, and they created a NACAR, a national association that combines economy and business and entrepreneurs, and to make sure that there's a chance to win in the economic battle and lift their communities up. I've mentioned Millbrook, for example. I mean, here's an organization that's been doing work on several fronts. And one of the areas that we found very interesting a few years ago, Gordon Doe, who was on a team, and ourselves having conversations with them about strategies that we were doing that they can learn from, and strategies that they were doing that we can learn from to move those companies further. The other areas that we see coming up is the Canadian Aboriginal and Minority Supplier Corporation. Like, for many years, Black and Aboriginal organizations had a difficult time being fully participants in the supply chain. And we are seeing that slowly those barriers are being challenged and breaking down. So the Canadian Aboriginal and Minority Supply Chain insists that not only on government strategies, but how do you impact the private sector so that in their supply chain, you don't speak about diversity, you live it. So you start beginning to engage companies and consultants into where the spend is. These strategies would destroy the common challenges that both the Indigenous and Black communities have in those similar issues that intersect. Let's take, for example, in Nova Scotia, the urban shipbuilding strategy. That's a 35-year spend. One of the first agencies that were involved in that is the First Nations and Indigenous communities, who actually were able to get into that contract in terms of job creation and economic moves. In the end, a similar cohort of Black tradespeople were involved in that area as well. And we see a deepening move to further engage businesses, community consultants in developments and industries. Not only the construction sector, which has been traditionally an area where Black communities have participated, but in the new economy. Even now, as we speak about generational wealth and investment in terms of now tying into the new economy, I think an untapped area that we can clearly designate is the fourth industrial revolution, the tech and digital economy. And you're seeing more and more Black companies and First Nations and Indigenous companies who are looking at those economies of scale. Just some areas that you may not know. Do you know that it was a Black business owner who developed the first dry AIDS test in Nova Scotia? Dr. Abby Kiramura, I think Trinda might know him from that side of the town, who has been at the beginning of the science strategies. And now you're seeing more and more companies who are involved in that. These will help us to overcome the marginalization of companies into strictly service industries, whether it's restaurants and hair care and those other strategies, which, although very worthy causes, sometimes don't have the incremental margins as manufacturing and those areas. So one of the areas that we actually insist on is how can we work with the indigenous communities to tie those pieces together. There's also the opportunity of participation in terms of the networking, areas like summits, knowledge and information transfer, and room for growth. Without those areas, not only does the Black community get further behind, but it also challenges the long-standing and historic Black community in Nova Scotia and the First Nations community. It also challenges how do you get into the key market areas in development. We see this as a necessity. We see this as a way forward. And we know that those areas are the areas that we need to focus on more fully so that we can be engaged in the full economy. Like if you're not participating if it's good for the Black community, it's good for Nova Scotia, and by extension, it's good for Canada. Similarly, the First Nations communities as well. I just want to let you know, this is a historic time. COVID has changed the way we look at work, and that will be a legacy of coming out of COVID. But because of the fact that folks were at home, when George Floyd was brutally murdered in the US, that has also changed significant perception to others who have you're now seeing corporations who actually may have thought about it, who are now realizing that we have to do something. And of course, we're not in this alone. It's not just a slang phrase. I think that we're in this together. And the common thread between Rosa Parks and Viola Desmond is that two Black women had to sit down to stand up for change. And I think when you see that happening, those are the kind of things that motivate us to rethink how the standard areas that we've always thought about. Those are the areas that I want to cover. I hope I covered most of the items that would show the connection between the Indigenous community and the Black community in terms of economics, entrepreneurship, community, and business development.
Thank you so very much. That was a very interesting conversation. So we'll open it up to the floor for any questions. You'd like to put them in the chat?
Holly, I would like to.
We can hear you.
Oh, good. Holly, I would like to say to Rustam, thank you very much for your comments, which were very heartfelt and sound. So thank you very much, sir, for your contribution.
Yeah, I don't have any questions at the moment. Does anyone on the committee have any questions? Okay, I guess we'll roll into the moderated panel discussion. David, did you want to, as I just coming on tonight, filling in for Jason, is this something that you and Chair sort of manage?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. So this session is basically opening up the session to any comments, suggestions, questions that anyone would like to make. And I'd like to start off with a comment to Rustam. I'm wondering, Rustam, whether there is any further way we as Africans of Canadian descent can work with Indigenous communities. Is there anything further to what you've already said that we can further develop? That would be very helpful to hear your views on this as a major contributor to the African Canadian context.
Yeah, thanks for that, David. I mean, I sincerely believe that we have to do more. When we set up the FACE coalition that's delivering the Black Entrepreneurship Loan Fund, one of the things that we look closely at is NACR, which is the Indigenous Communities Economic Strategy, National Aboriginal Capital Cooperation Association. And I believe we can learn quite a bit from that when we speak about we're now speaking about intergenerational wealth and other strategies with how do we enrich the community ourselves, and how do we elevate our communities to understand the importance of investing in the communities. You see areas like the Black Opportunity Fund and others who are being developed to drive those areas as well. So I think that we can do more. My own experience, David, was the former Lieutenant Governor Mayor Francis who had flagged the work that Member 2 was doing in Cape Breton, and that's when I first met Bern Christmas. And I think we don't do enough to use those strategies to move our own community at that level. So, I mean, the answer is yes, we can do more. There'd probably be 1,000 type of things that we can do in working together. I mean, one of the most impressive economic moves that yet to be a fruit was the fact that Clearwater and some of the larger fishing contracts is now an Aboriginal or First Nation owned company, which is a huge international company and investment, and we can learn from that, and certainly can participate in that area as well. So don't have all of the strategies here tonight, but would be willing to brainstorm on so many areas that we can take benefit of doing that. The thing is that folks who are being marginalized, if you think in terms of the Black loyalists and others, folk who are being marginalized sometimes need to work together to move the needle on those strategies. And yeah, would be happy to think through some of those areas that can actually overcome those challenges.
Thank you very much, Rustam. Very, very helpful indeed. Thank you. Very positive. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have one more question probably before we close. What is the one thing you would recommend a non-Indigenous and non-Black individual to do to support the Indigenous people in communities of Black descent?
I wanted to thank Mr. Southwell for the presentation. That was great. And I really appreciated your insights into community partnership, right? And how, right, as disadvantaged communities can come together and create something more. And I do sit on the Black Opportunity Fund, not as much as I would like. So I know that there's some like really great things happening there. I think in supporting Indigenous and Black communities, I always think it's important to take the lead, like to follow the lead that is given, and also be really clear that you're kind of following direction and that you'll make mistakes when you're doing it. Mm-hmm. And I think if there's a way that we can also, work against, this kind of competition need, right? So competition is healthy in business, but it's not necessarily healthy in community, especially when it starts to pull us apart, right? The divide and rule piece, right? Divide and conquer. And so I think if there's ways that we can continue to say we have similar yet distinct histories, and then have similar and distinct present moment, that we can continue to come together to create more fruitful and more thriving relationships and community, coalitions. And so I think that would be really important. And I always think it's good. I had somebody asked the question about land acknowledgements. I always think it's important to, especially in Nova Scotia, to acknowledge the longstanding history of African Nova Scotians. It doesn't take away from the custodial relationship of the territory, but it does acknowledge the ways in which slavery also structured how we even understand this physical space, right? Which is why I like to include that information about the Citadel. We've all watched sunsets from that space, but did we all realize that much of that was built by enslaved African people? And so we can't enjoy the space in the land without also acknowledging not just labor, but the harm that went into creating that particular site. And so that's why I always think it's important to acknowledge the longstanding history of African Nova Scotians.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dryden. Thank you so much.
Okay, we probably have time for this one quick question that's come in. Oh, there's one more, just a second here. Is there any closing remarks? We have about 3 minutes.
I would like to, Holly, if I may say, I wish to thank both speakers for their excellent contributions to this evening. It's been heartwarming, hugely informative, and I'm deeply grateful. Thank you.
Godfrey, did you want to have any remarks before we close?
Thanks, Holly. I think Professor Devine has already said it all, and I don't really have anything useful to add other than to say I miss Dr. Dresden's presentation because of work, but I can understand from that Professor Devine's remarks what has transpired, and I heard what Mr. Sadwell said. So thank you very much. Very informative. I think it's an important area that you looked at, and looking at the similarities and the differences, and how we can forge together as minority groups. There's a common enemy for the two groups, which is obviously discrimination, lack of intergenerational wealth, and the means to even achieve that. So I think that has come to light really well, and thank you very much for making time to do this.
Thank you, Godfrey.
Thanks. And so I probably should say thank you for inviting us. I know I haven't spoken to Dr. Dryden for a little bit, but and David in particular, like coming here, it sort of opens your eyes to how far we've gotten, but how far we have yet to go.
Yes.
And I sincerely believe that a lot of it is collaborative, and so for the most part, we have to be willing to put our shoulders to the wall and push still, because one of my biggest fears right now is that we've gone through 2 years, 20-something months, and it's likely that once it's gotten so far, things will get tighter. And so how do we prepare ourselves for the inevitable challenges up ahead? And those are the areas of concern. We've had the Black Loyalists in Shelburne and others who have been doing this for hundreds of years. And we have an opening now that we need to gather together and work closely to overcome those challenges.
Yep,
So thank you
I
for
agree,
your-
Rustam.
thanks for
Thank you
invitation.
so much for that wise information. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to Rotarians and friends for joining us this evening. This recording will be on our 7820 YouTube channel in probably about a week.
Thank you, Holly, for all your work. It's very, very much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks again for inviting us. Good night.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you,
Good
Dr.
night,
Dryden.
everybody.